to stop the recording.
Is this?
Hello, I'm Avi Markovitz, Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. Every year, around January 27th, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, pays tribute to the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and reaffirms its unwavering commitment to counter anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of intolerance that may lead to group-targeted violence. The date marks the anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi concentration and extermination camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Our first survivor is Anita Weisbord. Anita, born in Vienna, experienced Germany annexing Austria and was sent to the Kindertransport to England as a child.
I think it's working.
We apologize for the technical difficulty. Anita will begin again. Thank you.
Start again?
Yes.
My name is Anita Weisbord. I was born in Vienna, Austria. I was the youngest of three. I had a wonderful childhood. I had everything a child needs: loving parents, brother and sister, a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins and friends. Vienna is a beautiful city, went on vacations, and everything a child needs, I had. We lived very well. Now, Jews lived in Austria for hundreds of years. They were a pillar of the community. And when Hitler marched into Austria, the Anschluss was March the 13th, 1938. They were chanting, marching on the street and chanting, Hitler away, Jude verrecke. That means Hitler away, Jews perish. That was the end of my childhood, the way I knew it. Overnight, you become a non-person. You have no rights. In Germany, Hitler was already in power for quite a few years. Every year, another law came out. You couldn't go to school, you couldn't go to university, you couldn't go even to a movie or even sit on the bench in the park. In Austria, within 24 hours, all those were in place. Left your home, you don't know if you come back. People disappeared. It was very scary time. Jews, after that happened, overnight, everything changed. I had a girlfriend who lived next door. We went to school together, played together. There was never any difference. I used to be in her house, helping decorate the Christmas tree. She liked to be in my house, eat matzo ball soup. There was never any difference about our difference of religion. We respected each other. And once Hitler marched into Austria, she was afraid to talk to me because if somebody would see her together with me, they would denounce her and she could be arrested. So that was a very sad for both of us. Then came Crystal Night, the night of the broken glass. It was November the 9th and 10th. Hundreds of old synagogues were burned in Vienna, except one they couldn't burn because it was in a very narrow street and it was attached to other houses. They were afraid the whole block might burn, but they used the synagogue as a stable for their horse. And they looted Jewish businesses. That's why it's called the Night of the Broken Glass. Looted the businesses. They came into our home, arrested my father, who ended up in Dachau concentration camp, smashed some furniture, and helped themselves to whatever they want. Now you would think to call the police. You couldn't, because there were one of them. There was absolutely nothing you could do. You just hope. My sister and I were scared they shouldn't hurt my mother. My mother realized that she has to save her children. She has to do something. My brother, who was already in his early 20s, his so-called friends were going to come for him. So he went illegally to France. He was in Paris. Now, in Europe, you needed identity papers. Of course, he had none. And one day it was the French police who stopped him and asked for his papers. As he had none, they were going to send him back. You can just imagine what would happen if they sent him back. So he joined the French Foreign Legion and ended up in Africa. Right after Crystal Night, Hitler waited. How will the world react to what he has done? The world was quiet, except there was one country who had some compassion, and that was England. Right after Crystal Night, they had a debate in Parliament. What could they do? They decided to take in an unspecified number of children. They had to be under 17 years of age and come alone. That was called the Kindertransport. December the 2nd, the first left for England until August, just before war broke out. Within 10 months, 10,000 children were saved. 90% of all those children never saw their parents again. I remember my mother and my aunt my aunt having 4 children, having a violent argument. My aunt called my mother a rotten mother. How can you send your children away? How can you do that? You know, until I became a mother, did I realize they were both right. What does a mother want to do? What does your mother want to do? Hold your clothes, right? What mothers do. But I truly believe my mother gave to me twice, and I was born. I had the strength and the foresight to send me on the capital. Children were saved. 90% of all the children never saw their parents again. I don't remember how many children were on the train, but there were 2 years old and 3 years old who had no idea what happened to them. They just cried for their mothers. They grew in England, nice boys and girls. And if somebody survived and came for them, they couldn't even remember them because they were too young. I remember the day I left was March the 13th, 1939. I only remember the date because it was the 1-year anniversary of Hitler marching into Austria. We were at the train station. I was inside the train, the windows tightly closed. My mother is outside for 4 agonizing hours. The train stood there. I'm inside, my mother is outside. I was afraid to step away from the window. I was afraid I would lose her forever. You know, that's over 80 years ago. And to this day, I cannot stand anybody sending me that left that impression. All the world took care of the little ones. And I felt sorry for the little ones. We went through Germany, the border of Holland. The Nazis came into the train. We were only allowed to take a small suitcase. A small suitcase, only no valuables. So suitcases threw it all over, yelled at us. If anybody smuggled anything, back you go. We were scared, but nothing happened. We went over to the border of Holland and we felt free. There were ladies on the platform who gave us hot chocolate and sandwiches. I remember it's the first time I ever saw white bread. Now, you know, today with television and all what is happening, you know what happens in the world instantly. We didn't have that in 1938. Had no idea where England was. Didn't know the language. We didn't know who's going to take care of us. So it was a very scary way of knowing what's going to happen and leaving all the loved ones behind, which was very difficult. But at least we were free and always worried what will happen to the ones we left behind. You know, we tell you the story of the Holocaust to show you where hate can lead to. Don't be bystanders when you see something happens. Be upstanders. If more people would have spoken up, it might have never happened.
Thank you, Anita. Our next survivor is Renee Silver, who was born in the German state of Saarland. During the Holocaust, Renee and her sister were hidden in the Protestant community of Le Chambon, France. We may have some technical difficulty. I do apologize, and we'll hopefully have that fixed in a minute.
Okay, all set? The Holocaust was a descent into hell in which millions perished in acts aided and abetted by millions, not only in Germany, but in countries defeated and annexed by the Germans, and even in countries far removed, such as the United States, who refused to hear the cries of despair and offer asylum. Yes, yet there were those who had the courage to care, despite in many cases the dangers to their own lives and the lives to their loved ones. In 1945, at war's end, my immediate family, mother, father, little sister Edith and I, slowly realized that we were the only survivors in Europe. Some family members had emigrated to Brazil and to the United States before the war. The rest, my grandfather, uncles, aunts, my parents' cousins, were exterminated in extermination camps. How did the four of us survive? When France was defeated and divided into occupied and unoccupied France, we found ourselves in Villeurbanne, just outside of Lyon, in occupied France. This was also known as Vichy France, as the town of Vichy was its capital, under the leadership of the aging Maréchal Philippe Pétain. Pétain's first official act was to create a special ministry to deal with la question juive, the Jewish question. Pierre Laval, a virulent anti-Semite, was put in charge of the department. Armies of lawyers went to work to determine who was a Jew and in which ways Jews would be dealt with. Jews were no longer allowed into certain restaurants, parks, public places. They could not attend special schools for the gifted. Medicine, engineering, and law were closed to them. Concentration camps sprang up throughout France. While they were not extermination camps, they were portals to such camps. French police rounded up the Jews. French military guarded them, and French railroads were used to transport them to the extermination camps. When these new edicts became the law of the land, there were a few who stood up and expressed their humanity. The pastor of a small Huguenot community in the Massif Central was one of these giants. André Trocmé was a pacifist. As soon as the new laws were proclaimed and preached, He preached a sermon outside of the temple of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where in his sonorous voice he proclaimed, "We shall fight with the weapons of the Spirit." He galvanized not only his immediate flock of parishioners with the help of like-minded religious leaders and teachers in the regions, enabled a network of rescuers. Thus, some 2,500 people saved the lives of some 5,000 Jewish children and young people. The area where this occurred is somewhat cut off from the rest of France. At the end of the 16th century, during the war between Catholics and Protestants, many Protestants fled France, and many settled on this hard-to-reach plateau in southwestern France. They were called the Huguenots. In 1942, these Huguenots, these Protestants, as well as other Christians in the region, defied the new French laws, risking their own lives and the lives of their families. They were sincerely religious, conscious of the sanctity of human life. They followed the laws of the Old Testament, and often the code word for a Jew was an Old Testament. My little sister, then 9, and I, 11, were saved by being taken to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, although we were too young to realize why we were taken there. We thought we were going to the mountains and did not really understand that we were being hidden until it became apparent that we would be separated and were told we could not write to our parents or receive any mail. During that same period, my parents' lives were saved by the action of individuals who acted entirely on their own. My best friend was Renee Silver. Her parents were the janitors of a large municipal complex in Villeurbanne, where we lived. The complex housed a municipal clinic, theater, and swimming pool. The Cossidiers had a small apartment in the building, and adjacent to their quarters were municipal offices. In July 1942, these offices were used to house the Pétain police, French version of the Gestapo, and sent there to round up the Jews in the area. Such roundups were called rafles, meaning raids. They usually took place at night when the victims were more likely to be home. One morning, Monsieur Cossidier overheard the policemen gleefully announce to one another in the bathroom, "This is it, we're going to get them all tonight." He knew exactly what they meant. While he had never met my parents, he knew I was Jewish, and he knew where I lived. Without hesitating one moment, he spoke to his wife and walked over to my parents' apartment. He rang the bell, identified himself, and explained his reason for being there. Without hesitating, my parents followed him. Indeed, that very evening, my parents watched as their friends and neighbors were being loaded onto trucks and buses across the square from the municipal building where they were being hidden. The Cossidiers had no church affiliation. They were simply good human beings who recognized their opportunity to save 2 other human beings' lives. Had they hesitated or deliberated, it would have been too late. I would like to add that my father was totally paralyzed on his left side from a World War I injury. Under no circumstances could he have survived one moment in an extermination camp, nor could my mother, who loved him, have survived seeing him suffer. Le Chambon is a unique place where members of different Christian faiths, inspired by Pastor André Trocmé, protected, hid, and saved a large number of Jewish children. The Quakers, people like Varian Fry, members of Unitarian Universalists, also helped. In other parts of France, individuals of the Catholic Church saved numerous lives, creating baptismal certificates and new identities for Jewish children. The difference between the commission of evil and the willingness to turn away and ignore is not very great in the eyes of the just. To pretend it doesn't or didn't exist is evil too. We are all members of the human race and responsible for each other. Over the temple of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon's church are written the words, aimez-vous les uns les autres. Love one another. I would like to finish by quoting Elie Wiesel. Remember that it is easy to save human lives. One did not need to be heroic or crazy to feel pity for an abandoned child. It was enough to open a door, to throw a piece of bread, a shirt, a coin. It was enough to feel compassion. In those times, one climbed to the summit of humanity by simply remaining human.
Thank you, Renee. We also want to wish Renee a early happy birthday. She'll be 91. And Anita, our first speaker, we want to wish her also a early happy birthday. She'll be 99. In the backdrops of both Renee and Anita were the people or the time period of what they experienced. I would now like to introduce our final survivor, Werner Reich. Werner and his family were residents of Berlin, Germany, when the Nazis came to power after 2 years in the concentration camp. Werner was sent on the death march. Above Werner, as you will be able to see, is his artifact that he received while in the concentration camp. We apologize for having some technical difficulty. We'll be right back.
Whenever you're ready.
Let's start fresh. When I was 6 years old, my father lost his job in Germany because he was a Jew. And my sister and I, we couldn't go to school in Germany either because we were Jews. So we went to Yugoslavia and we lived there for 7 happy years. And then Germany invaded Yugoslavia and I went into hiding. And after 2 years, I was arrested and ended up in concentration camps. I was first in jail, and then I ended up in Czechoslovakia in a camp. And from there, I was transported to Auschwitz in Poland. In the meantime, Russia started to advance, and Germany kept losing the war. And prisoners in Polish concentration camps were transported to Austria and to Germany because the Germans were afraid that the Russians would discover that they had concentration camps. The other thing was that they were hoping to use the people who were transferred from these camps as part of their labor pool. They could use them in factories. But in January 1945, the Russians really kept advancing. And so they started emptying all these Polish concentration camps. And that's where the start of the death marches began. We were 60,000 of us, and we were given each a piece of bread and started to walk. We had very thin clothing made out of dishcloth material, and it didn't protect us from the absolutely incredible below zero temperatures. We had no fat on ourselves. We had no really coverage to protect ourselves against the cold. So we walked for a couple of hours, and after a couple of hours, we stopped, and people who couldn't get up were shot. And this went on all day. The first night, we ended up in some old stables, and there were maybe a dozen cows there, and the only place I could find where I could sleep was between the legs of a cow. So that's where I slept the first night. But the next day we got up and we continued walking. And it became harder and harder because we had no food. People were dragging, and there was snow. The only water which we had was snow and ice from the roads. And that's what we ate, or that's what we drank. That was our only nourishment, if you will. And the second night, we arrived at a silo, concrete silo, and we were told to lie down, all facing in one direction. And in the middle of the night, we were told to turn over in the other direction. And so we were frozen on both sides of our borders. And we continued the next morning. There was still absolutely no food or anything. The only food that we had was a piece of bread that they gave us at the beginning of the trip. And we had put it in our pockets, and that's where it froze. I tried to eat that piece of bread, but it was solid frozen was like a piece of ice, and there was no way I could eat it. And at the end of the day, we arrived at a railroad siding, and there were open railroad cars, coal cars, cars used for transportation of lumber or coal. And they shoved us into these railroad cars, and then the trip started. And I cannot describe to you how cold it was as the railroad cars moved and the wind blew all around us. The floor was steel and people just kept dying. We traveled like that for 4 days. I can remember the first day and a half of that trip. I cannot remember what happened afterwards. Today I'm still amazed that I'm still alive. We traveled like that until we came to a stop in Austria, which was 4 days after the trip started. And that's where we ended up in the concentration camp of Mauthausen. Mauthausen was a old quarry, really, that had been converted to a concentration camp. And many of the prisoners, they were prisoners of war from other countries. There were Spanish prisoners of war there. There were also French prisoners of war. And when we tried to get out of the railroad cars, I had great difficulty walking, and many of the people couldn't even get out. And we limped up to the camp, and then we were showered, and we all collapsed because all of us were frostbitten. It was the most excruciating pain I ever endured in my entire life. And after 2 days, my feet started to rot because they were dead. And there was a prisoner of war in the camp who was a doctor before the war. And he had somehow gotten hold of a knife. I don't know where he got it from or what. And he cut off my toes on one foot and part of the toes of the other foot. And that's how he saved my life. And then things really began to get really bad because there was no food there. And people died from hunger. We ended up getting a tablespoon of moldy bread a day. I slept next to a dead man for 3 days just to get his ration. There were big piles of dead bodies all over the camp. And some of these piles were moving because people were still breathing. But there was no food there. On the 5th of May, which was 2 days before the end of the war, we were liberated by American forces. And they didn't expect to see us there. And they suddenly found themselves with thousands upon thousands of dead bodies. And we smelled to high heaven. We haven't washed or showered for 5 months. We were still in the same uniforms that we wore in Auschwitz. And we were covered with feces and with dirt. And there was no food there. So they gave us American military rations. and we ate these rations, and thousands of prisoners died because there were far too many calories. So after, sorry, after about 3 weeks, we were permitted to leave the camp. By that time, I was 17 years old and I weighed 64 pounds. And we hitchhiked back home. And when we came home, we had no parents, we had no family, we had no friends, we had nothing. But we entered into a completely new world for us, which was extreme communism. It sort of destroyed the entire country. Before, the Germans were persecuting one group of people, now the communists were persecuting another. The Holocaust killed about 12 million people. There were not only Jews, there were Jehovah's Witnesses, there were gypsies, there were communists, there were gay people, there were Russians, there were whole groups of people that were destroyed, and strictly because they were there. None of them committed any crimes, none of them had done anything that was illegal or that should have put them in jail, but they were put in jail and killed. The question is, could the Holocaust have been avoided? And the answer is yes. If enough people would have opened their mouth and said something, but nobody said anything. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. If you know somebody, a friend or anybody in your school who needs help, who needs support, who needs a nice word, open your mouth. Don't be a silent friend. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. If you would like to learn more about our virtual and in-person programs, please visit us at hmtcli.org. In closing, I want to quote the late Elie Wiesel, survivor. The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. That means the opposite of education is not ignorance, it's indifference. The opposite of beauty is not ugliness, but indifference. The opposite of life is not death, but indifference. Indifference to life and death. So whatever you do in your life, indifference is never an option. Indifference is never the beginning of a process. It's the end of a process. We all have a responsibility to combat injustice by not being indifferent. Thank you again for joining us.